TV networks, yes, including CBC, were falling over themselves with those flashy graphics, the massive panels, the countdown clocks, all of it, as the impeachment hearings went public this week. The Democrats are hoping to persuade more Americans to impeach Trump. The country's split in half. So will the hearings make a difference? We keep hearing comparisons to Watergate.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. That I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Nixon knew Americans were glued to their sets, that one set that people had in the living room. 150 million Americans said they watched those hearings live, and a big chunk watched 10 hours or more. They binged on testimony. Boy, have things changed. This week, 14 million Americans watched on cable and a few million more streamed it online. That's a lot, but nowhere near the 3 out of 4 that watched Watergate. A lot of people opted for the after shows on cable news, which was very different depending which network you turn to. Trump, well, he calls the hearings a hoax. Don't watch, he says, a theme picked up by his friends at Fox News.
It's a comedy at this point. It's so ridiculous.
So they had no firsthand information whatsoever.
This is stupid. A week from now, you won't remember the details.
Check out how other more left-wing pundits picked up the Democrat strategy. They switched this week from calling Trump's behavior a quid pro quo, which was hard to understand or pronounce, to calling it bribery.
This is a very strong case of bribery.
And said, I'll give you this if you comply with all of my demands and all of my conditions. That's bribery.
What we clearly have is bribery.
I'm joined now by a familiar face who knows the cable news universe. Ali Velshi, he started out on Canadian networks, but he's long been in the United States at CNN. He's now a host on MSNBC. He's in New York. So, Ali, all this spin, I mean, it must be a lot of fun to be a journalist in the middle of all this these days.
Well, I might find a different word than fun. There are days when I look north and think there's a simplicity I miss out of this whole thing. It is very interesting. It's a lot of work. And the interesting part about it is that the last time we had hearings like this, whether it was Oliver North or whether it was the Nixon impeachment hearings, the nation was glued to it. Now people get their news from different places. So not everybody shares the same view after watching the same thing or watching interpretations or news coverage of the same thing.
So the reviews have been somewhat mixed. You've got a lot of headlines saying that the testimony has been very compelling, but you've also got a couple of others saying plenty of substance, but little drama. You tweeted you didn't like that.
Yeah, that's a problem. I'm not sure whether we should be in the business of telling our viewers, meaning we in the media should be telling our viewers what drama looks like. Everything that we are talking about here is of remarkable substance and remarkably important. But the normalization of the Trump administration and the sorts of things that we've become used to mean that if there's a hearing in which nobody swears, nobody throws anything, nobody really yells at anybody else, nobody finds somebody in a gotcha moment, then it appears to some to be absent drama. I think people who watch these things, people like you and I watch these things with great interest. We enjoy congressional testimony or parliamentary testimony. We find information in the testimony that's being put forward. I think a lot of people in today's day and age say, I'm busy. I know what Donald Trump is. I know what the story largely is. So unless there's some bombshell, aha, gotcha moment, I'm not sure whether the needle is moved.
Well, I saw one of your colleagues at CNN, Brian Stelter, he got in trouble for saying if this episode isn't as exciting as Netflix, everyone will change the channel. I mean, is that where we are?
We kind of are, right? I mean, this is one of those things where the drama put forth by the president and his administration on a daily basis fills the airwaves. His tweets in particular, as you mentioned, garner a certain public attention. So regular testimony, as we've seen in this past week, from career diplomats and government officials who are not given to drama. They're not about that. They are saying they witnessed things that they thought were highly irregular. Well, in the language of diplomacy, that's a very big deal. Ambassadors saying they were forced out or they were threatened or they saw side deals being made by people who were not in governmental channels. 15, 20 years ago, Wendy, what a big thing that would have been. And today people say, well, it's Trump being Trump. How big a deal is it? What was he really trying to do? And so I do think that it is, it's something that we have to do as journalists. We have to be very careful. We have to put the facts forward. We have to let people come to their own conclusions about how they feel about what happened. But I think characterizing things as drama-free or not that exciting isn't in the public interest at the moment.
Many years ago, it used to be a collective experience. People even at the office, they could sit together and watch something. Now we'd be screaming at each other or we'd be moving on to the next thing. It's not really a collective experience anymore.
That is a very big deal. That's a very big difference. If you remember when we went into the Nixon hearings, you wouldn't remember, but history will tell us that when we went into those hearings, Americans were not in favor of impeaching Richard Nixon. They watched the testimony that pointed to wrongdoing, and Americans shifted, and as a result, Republicans shifted, and the tide turned against Richard Nixon. Now everybody's in their corners. It's not a collective experience, nor is watching the proceedings. Some people don't watch it. We're busy doing other things. People have it on their phones, but they don't have it on their phones. They don't get briefings from the hearing. They get briefings from their chosen media organizations, many of whom cater to their political leanings. And that's the problem. We've self-selected into hearing what you want to hear. So if you are a Fox viewer, you hear something different than a CNN viewer watches, or that an MSNBC viewer watches, or whether you're getting your news from some other curated website. And it's not a shared experience. This whole process is a remarkably different experience depending on where you sit on the political spectrum.
Ali Velshi, thank you so much. So great to talk to you.
It is my pleasure to be with you, Wendy. Thank you.
Ali Velshi in New York. Now we turn to two people who've been on the inside watching the hearings and how it's being spun by the media and, of course, the political parties. Jill Wine-Banks was a prosecutor during Watergate. She joins us from Chicago. And Stephen Binhack was a prosecutor with Ken Starr's Whitewater team. He's in Miami. Jill, I'm going to start with you. I want to ask both of you to react to that sort of live tweet during the testimony. While the former ambassador to Ukraine was testifying at the hearings, the president tweeted live that everywhere Marie Yovanovitch went turned bad. Jill, I mean, what kind of impact would that have on the hearings? Would that have on the prosecutors?
What we saw with the tweet was how brazen the conduct of the president is. In the same way that he placed or had a conversation the day after talking to President Zelensky about doing investigations, he followed up in a conversation with Ambassador Sondland. He is just brazen. And that conversation, the phone call with Zelensky, was the day after Mueller testified. So he's getting more and more brazen because nothing is happening to him. As to whether there had been a Fox News at the time of John Dean or any social media that would have allowed President Nixon to act that way, I do think the outcome might have been different. I think, for example, if he had been tweeting about John Dean, it would have undermined John Dean's credibility. But in the end, there were facts that proved that John Dean was credible and that the president and all his men were lying.
Stephen, I want to talk about the Republican strategy here and how that's played out in the media. There seems to be this judgment that by the Democrats that the quid pro quo, is not only hard to pronounce, but wasn't exactly selling their case for them. They're now talking about bribery. Is that how? I'll come to you for that in a moment, Joe. But how do you read that, Stephen?
Well, I think it's. I think people are now starting to coalesce around certain facts, right? I think it's pretty clear that there was a Giuliani effort, and it was different than the State Department effort in the Ukraine. And I think it's pretty clear that that the aid was held up. And so now the question is, well, what does that mean, and how do we treat that in an impeachment hearing? And once you get to that point, you get to where we were in Nixon and where we were in Clinton, which is people start to coalesce around the facts, and then the question is, what do we do about it? So Speaker Pelosi wants to say bribery because the impeachment clause of the Constitution includes the word bribery, right? And the Republicans want to say it's not a bribe. This is what a president does. Presidents are entitled to conduct the foreign affairs of the country, and if the president wants to condition aid, foreign aid on something, he's entitled to do it. And I think what they're trying to do, the Republicans are trying to do, is elevate the discussion above the facts and try to make this a principle so that their base can lock onto a principle without dealing with difficult facts.
I think quid pro quo is a bad term to use for several reasons. One is people don't exactly know what it means, but more importantly, you don't need a this for that. The solicitation of assistance from a foreign government is a violation of everything that we hold dear in America. Asking for help in our own domestic elections by a foreign country is wrong, and American people understand that. I don't care whether you call it bribery or extortion, but that's what it is.
What will the impact be on public opinion, Stephen?
Well, that's the interesting thing. It's very hard to tell. What's always fascinating to me is that Nixon started his service as president with 68% approval. Even at the Saturday Night Massacre, when he fired the Attorney General of the United States, only 40% of the people wanted him impeached. But by the time the Supreme Court ruled that he had to turn over the tapes, 1 week later or 2 weeks later, Jill, you'll know better than I, but it's in July and August, the end of July and early August, Nixon's resigning. So things can happen extremely quickly, and things can change really quickly. So in many ways, the facts of the last week have been pretty difficult for the president. I think they're going to get more difficult, and who knows what the people will latch onto. Ambassador Yovanovitch got a standing ovation in the hearing room.
Yeah.
If she got a standing ovation in the United States, that could be a very critical change for the president.
So, Jill, just how different is this? I mean, you were there during the Watergate hearings. Just how different is this now, and will public opinion be changed?
I think in the end, I remain optimistic. Once they see all the facts, they will realize the danger to America's national security and to world peace, to the fact that if the Ukrainians are not empowered to fight the Russians, that fight may come to our shores.
Thank you so much to talk about. More to come, more hearings this week. Thanks so much to both of you, Jill Wine-Banks in Chicago and Stephen Binhack in Miami. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.